Serial killers' nicknames come up a lot on this show, but for my money, the best one probably is the first one, Jack the Ripper.
This is how one of history's most infamous mysteries was finally narrowed to a single ordinary man after more than 137 years. It explains how modern DNA analysis, overlooked Victorian police records, and a forgotten piece of evidence combined to identify Jack the Ripper with greater clarity than ever before. The city that allowed a killer. In the late 1980s, Whitechapel, a district in the East End of London, was one of the most densely populated urban areas in the world. Tens of thousands of people lived within a few square blocks, compressed into decaying tenements where entire families slept in single rooms. Disease was constant, employment was unstable, and hunger shaped daily decisions. This environment did not create Jack the Ripper, but it made his crimes possible. The district was defined by extreme poverty. Many residents relied on casual labor that paid by the day, or sometimes by the hour. When work disappeared, so did shelter. Lodging houses, often called doss houses, offered temporary beds for a few pennies. If a person could not pay, they were turned away into the streets. Women who lacked family support or steady income were especially vulnerable. Law enforcement presence in Whitechapel existed, but it was stretched thin. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police divided jurisdiction across neighbouring streets, which created confusion over responsibility and response. Patrols were predictable, lighting was poor, and many alleyways were invisible from main roads. Violence was common enough that individual assaults rarely drew sustained attention unless a body was discovered. Public health conditions added another layer. Slaughterhouses operated near residential streets, and animal blood regularly drained into gutters. The smell of decay was constant. This detail mattered because it normalized sights and odors that would later obscure crime scenes. Blood in the street did not always signal murder. It often signaled routine business. At the time, forensic science did not exist in any recognizable form. There were no fingerprints, no blood typing, and no standardized methods for preserving evidence. Crime scenes were frequently contaminated by crowds, curious onlookers, and even police officers themselves. Objects were handled without gloves, clothing was moved, written records were inconsistent and often incomplete. Social attitudes also played a role. The victims were women from the margins of society. Many had struggled with alcoholism, illness, or homelessness. Their lives were rarely documented in detail before their deaths, and public sympathy was limited. Newspapers focused more on the identity of the killer than on the people he murdered. This imbalance shaped how the story was recorded and remembered. When the murders began in 1888, the city was already accustomed to hardship. What changed was the pattern. These were not random assaults. They were methodical killings concentrated in a small geographic area, committed during specific hours, and carried out with speed. Yet the environment of Whitechapel absorbed the violence instead of exposing it. The streets hid the killer, not because he was clever, but because the city was overwhelmed. This setting is essential to understanding what followed. The failure to identify Jack the Ripper at the time was not caused by a single mistake or missed clue. It was the result of a city stretched beyond its limits, using tools that were not capable of answering the questions being asked. The answer was there, but the era could not yet see it. The pattern the police missed. The first confirmed victim was Mary Ann Nichols, discovered on August 31, 1888, on Bucks Row, a narrow street in Whitechapel. She was found with her throat cut and her abdomen mutilated. At the time, police treated the killing as another example of street violence common to the area. What they failed to recognize was that this murder introduced a pattern that would define everything that followed. 1 week later, on September 8, 1888, Annie Chapman was found dead in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her injuries were more extensive than Nichols's, and specific organs had been removed. The medical examination noted that the cuts were deliberate and precise, carried out quickly and with confidence. This was not rage. It was controlled violence carried out within a narrow time window, likely less than 10 minutes. These two murders established the structure of the crimes. Each victim was killed outdoors, in the early morning hours, within walking distance of common lodging houses. Each attack began with a deep cut to the throat, followed by abdominal mutilation. The killer did not steal valuables. He did not linger to stage the scene. He left as soon as the act was complete. Despite this consistency, investigators did not yet see the killings as connected. What made these deaths different was not immediately obvious to officers trained to look for robbery or personal disputes. The absence of witnesses and the lack of defensive wounds were noted, but not fully understood. The third and fourth murders occurred on the same night, September 30th, in what later became known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard off Berners Street, her throat cut, but her body otherwise untouched. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square inside the jurisdiction of the City of London Police. Her injuries were severe, and specific organs were removed and taken from the scene. This pairing mattered. Stride's lack of mutilation suggested interruption. Eddowes' injuries suggested compensation. Together, they demonstrated intent, planning, and adaptability. The killer adjusted to circumstances without abandoning his method. That adaptability indicated familiarity with the streets, confidence in escape routes, and awareness of police movement. The final confirmed victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was murdered on November 9, 1888, inside her single-room residence at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. This was the only indoor killing attributed to Jack the Ripper. The injuries were extreme, and the duration of the attack was far longer than any previous murder. The privacy of the room removed time pressure, revealing the full extent of the killer's behavior when uninterrupted. Across all 5 murders, the similarities outweighed the differences. The victims were women living in extreme poverty. The locations were clustered tightly within Whitechapel. The timing followed a consistent late-night pattern. The injuries followed a clear sequence. This was not random violence, it was a series of linked crimes committed by one individual who understood his environment and exploited it. What the police lacked was not effort, it was perspective. Without forensic science, behavioral analysis, or a centralized investigative framework, the pattern remained fragmented across reports and jurisdictions. Each crime was documented, but the larger picture was never fully assembled in real time. That failure would shape the investigation for decades. The identity of Jack the Ripper would become a subject of speculation precisely because the earliest opportunity to see him clearly had already passed. Names without proof. As the murders ended and public pressure intensified, the investigation shifted from chasing an active killer to reviewing internal records. This phase produced the first serious names connected to Jack the Ripper, not through arrests or trials, but through confidential police documents that were never meant for the public. One of the most important sources was a private memorandum written in 1894 by Melville McNaughton, who served as Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police. This document identified 3 men McNaughton believed were viable suspects based on internal intelligence rather than courtroom evidence. The names were Montague John Druitt, Michael Ostrog, and Aaron Kosminski. None of them had been charged. None had been questioned in open court. Each appeared only in internal correspondence. Montague John Druitt was a barrister whose body was recovered from the River Thames weeks after the final murder. His inclusion rested on timing and family suspicion rather than physical evidence. Michael Ostrog was a known criminal with a history of confinement, but no clear connection to Whitechapel during the murders. Both names generated interest later among theorists, but neither was supported by surviving documentation tying them directly to the crime scenes. Aaron Kosminski stood apart. He lived in Whitechapel during the murders. He worked as a hairdresser, a profession that involved regular use of sharp instruments. Within 3 years of the killings, he was committed to an asylum after displaying severe mental deterioration, including auditory hallucinations and paranoid behavior. His confinement in 1891 aligned closely with the permanent end of the murders. Further confirmation appeared decades later in the private writings of Donald Swanson, the chief inspector assigned to the case. Swanson's handwritten notes were discovered in the margins of a published memoir by Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. In those notes, Swanson stated that the police had identified the killer and arranged a covert identification at the Seaside Home convalescent facility. According to Swanson, the witness refused to testify because the suspect was also Jewish, and public exposure could have triggered unrest. That refusal mattered. Under Victorian legal standards, a murder charge required a cooperating witness or direct physical proof. Suspicion alone was not sufficient. Without testimony, the case could not proceed, even if senior officers believed they had the correct man. As a result, the suspect was quietly monitored rather than arrested, then eventually institutionalized. This information remained buried for decades. It did not appear in official case summaries or public reports. It survived only in marginal notes, private memoranda, and personal correspondence. The absence of a trial created space for speculation, and speculation eventually replaced documentation. By the time modern investigators gained access to these documents, the opportunity to question witnesses, preserve original evidence, or reconstruct scenes had long passed. What remained was a paper trail pointing consistently in one direction, anchored by Aaron Kosminski, but never sealed by the standards of his time. That gap between belief and proof is where the mystery hardened. It would remain unresolved until science introduced a tool the 19th century did not possess: the evidence that survived. More than a century after the murders, the investigation changed direction because of a single object that had been overlooked for generations. This object was a silk shawl, said to have been recovered from the scene of the murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. For decades it was treated as a curiosity rather than evidence, passed quietly through a family connected to a City of London police officer. In 2006, the shawl resurfaced when it was purchased at auction by Russell Edwards, a British businessman with a long-standing interest in the case. Unlike previous collectors, Edwards focused not on display or ownership, but on verification. He sought to determine whether the item could still carry biological material that modern science could analyze. The shawl itself was heavily stained. These stains had long been assumed to be the result of age or environmental exposure. Edwards arranged for forensic testing to determine whether they contained biological traces connected to the crime. The analysis was conducted by Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist with experience in degraded DNA samples. The testing focused on mitochondrial DNA, a type of genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line. Unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA can survive far longer in hostile conditions and is more likely to remain detectable on aged fabric. While it cannot identify an individual by itself, it can exclude or connect people through maternal ancestry. Samples taken from the shawl revealed two distinct biological profiles. One matched a direct maternal descendant of Catherine Eddowes, confirming that the shawl had been in contact with her blood. The second profile matched a living maternal descendant of Aaron Kosminski. This connection did not rely on interpretation or theory. It relied on inherited genetic markers that aligned across generations. The significance of this finding rested on accumulation rather than spectacle. The shawl linked the crime scene to the victim. The same object carried genetic material traceable to the suspect, already named in internal police documents decades earlier. The evidence did not stand alone. It reinforced an existing historical record. Criticism followed, as it always does in cases this old. Questions were raised about contamination, handling, and documentation. These concerns were valid and openly addressed. The shawl had passed through many hands. It had not been preserved under modern standards. The limitations of mitochondrial DNA were acknowledged clearly. What mattered was not perfection, it was probability. The convergence of location, timing, police suspicion, institutional records, and genetic material created a level of confirmation never before available in the case. No alternative suspect produced comparable alignment across independent sources. This was not a discovery that rewrote history overnight. It narrowed history with precision. It transformed a list of theories into a hierarchy of likelihood. For the first time, the identity of Jack the Ripper could be discussed with evidence that existed beyond speculation, interpretation, or literary reconstruction. The shawl did not solve the case by itself. It completed a chain that had been broken by time. What followed was not celebration, but reckoning, as the focus shifted from mystery to meaning. Answers that held. Skeptics pointed out that the silk shawl was not stored under controlled forensic conditions and that it had been handled across multiple generations. Others questioned whether the genetic findings had been published in a traditional academic journal. These concerns addressed standards, not contradictions. No competing analysis produced a different suspect. No alternate biological profile emerged from the same material. Another line of criticism centered on certainty. The evidence was described as incomplete rather than incorrect. That distinction mattered. In historical investigations, especially those predating modern evidence handling, conclusions are built through convergence. Independent lines of information must align without relying on each other to exist. In this case, they did. The genetic link connected the shawl to Catherine Eddowes and to Aaron Kosminski's maternal line. Separately, Metropolitan Police records identified Kosminski as their primary suspect during the original investigation. Independently, asylum records documented his mental collapse and confinement. These elements were not discovered together, tested together, or interpreted together. They came from different centuries, different systems, and different motivations. Their alignment was the result of consistency, not coordination. Equally important was what did not appear. No other named suspect produced biological material tied to a victim. No alternate police memorandum identified a stronger candidate. No new document contradicted the internal consensus preserved in private writings. The absence of conflicting evidence strengthened the conclusion more than any single discovery. This phase also corrected a long-standing distortion in how the case had been framed. Popular theories often relied on elaborate conspiracies, secret societies, or royal involvement. These ideas thrived because they filled the gap left by uncertainty. The evidence redirected attention toward a far less theatrical reality. The killer was not protected by power or status. He was hidden by neglect, poverty, and the limits of the system meant to stop him. The confirmation also reframed the role of modern science. It did not overpower history or replace it. It verified what history had already recorded quietly and incompletely. The technology did not introduce a new suspect. It reinforced the one who had been there all along, waiting for a tool capable of validating what could not previously be proven. Once those means became available, the answer did not shift. It solidified. By this stage, the mystery had narrowed to a conclusion that resisted spectacle. It did not offer surprise, it offered resolution. The remaining question was no longer who Jack the Ripper was, but why the truth took so long to accept. When the legend ended. For more than a century, the case survived because it had no conclusion. The absence of a confirmed identity allowed the murders to be reshaped into myth, speculation, and entertainment. Once the evidence narrowed the answer, the mystery lost the quality that had kept it alive in popular culture. What replaced it was a quieter reality. Aaron Kosminski was not a figure of power, intelligence, or influence. He was a poor immigrant living in Whitechapel, dependent on family support, and gradually losing control of his mental health. He did not evade capture through brilliance or planning. He avoided prosecution because the legal system of Victorian England required proof that did not yet exist. His life ended not with exposure, but with institutionalization and obscurity. This outcome forces a reconsideration of how historical crimes are remembered. The fascination surrounding Jack the Ripper was built on anonymity. Once the anonymity fades, the violence becomes harder to romanticize. The killer was not a symbol of hidden elites or secret networks. He was a product of untreated illness, social neglect, and an environment unable to protect its most vulnerable residents. The victims' lives gain new weight in this context. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were not characters in a legend. They were individuals whose names survived largely because their deaths were never resolved. The confirmation of the killer's identity does not restore what was taken from them, but it removes the spectacle that overshadowed their lives. This case also demonstrates how historical truth often arrives without drama. There was no confession, no trial, and no public reckoning. The conclusion emerged through documents written in private, medical records stored without fanfare, and genetic material preserved by chance. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a conclusion strong enough to endure scrutiny. The role of modern DNA analysis in this process is often misunderstood. It did not rewrite the past, it verified it. The science did not create a new narrative. It confirmed one that had already been recorded quietly by investigators who lacked the ability to prove it. The value of this confirmation lies not in novelty, but in closure. The reason this truth remained hidden for so long is not complicated. It was ordinary. It did not fit the expectations built around the legend. It offered no grand conspiracy, no dramatic reveal, and no satisfying confrontation. It offered accountability without spectacle. That made it easier to ignore. The story that began with uncertainty ends with limitation. The limitation of systems, of technology, and of attention. The conclusion does not diminish the crimes. It places them where they belong, inside a real historical context shaped by poverty, illness, and institutional failure. The result was not a revelation designed to shock. It was a confirmation that the answer had been present all along, waiting for the moment when it could finally be proven.